I'd like to welcome Dr. Shanahan.
Thanks, Timothy. So I'll just take it away. So as you mentioned, I'm a family doctor. I've also been an athlete myself, and in my practice, I have a heavy sports medicine focus. And about 10 years ago, I started realizing that nutritional information I had learned in medical school was exactly backwards, and it changed a lot about the way I practice medicine. And in that time, I think there's been just a lot more movement in that direction of what I had learned being saturated fat was bad, polyunsaturated fat was healthy, that we've kind of had a big sea change in the world of weight loss medicine, where I'm also involved heavily. And because I also do sports medicine, I've applied a lot of that same kind of thinking and just like thinking in a different direction. And so that's what I want to cover today is we're overdue in both regular nutrition and sports nutrition for reconsideration of how is our current intake of carbohydrate and polyunsaturated fatty acid negatively impacting our health, and not just our health, but our athletic performance. So today what I wanted to cover is these points. That Americans were healthier before we started eating processed foods. I don't think anybody would argue with that. And I also believe that pretty much everyone who studies nutrition and its connection to health seriously acknowledges that the modern diet is the problem. Where people can disagree is what we should do instead. But I'm not going to be getting to that today. I'm just going to be talking about what is the modern diet doing to us and our athletes. Now, the point in time where we started deviating from what we had been doing before was shortly after World War II, when we were told to avoid saturated fat. And since then, we've gradually altered our diet so that today our diet is composed of somewhere around 80% of calories coming from refined carbohydrate and polyunsaturated fatty acids or fats from vegetable oils. Now, this has so I'm going to investigate how these two different macronutrients, the high carbohydrate, refined carbohydrate particularly, and the vegetable oils particularly, are impacting an athlete's performance. And what I've found is that there's reason to believe that athletes on a high carb diet, and again, particularly when we're talking about refined carbohydrates, sugars, and starchy foods that have been processed, they may become catecholamine resistant. And I'll explain what I mean by that. But basically, it's sort of like a precursor to insulin resistance, and they are more dependent on muscle glycogen for exercise rather than their own body fat, and they require more protein because of that. So I'll explain the physiology behind that. And then the other aspect of this is all that polyunsaturated fatty acid. What has that been doing to us? And this is something you rarely hear people talking about, but there's a lot of reason to believe that it can impair mitochondrial function. And mitochondria, obviously, are what athletes, without those, there wouldn't be athletes. There wouldn't be much else either. So, point one, we're going to go through each of these one at a time. We were healthier before we started eating processed foods. Take a close look here. So, more processed food in the, we've had gradually increasing amounts of processed food in the food supply since World War II. We have more data since 1980, so this chart starts at 1980. And what we're seeing on this chart is between the years 1980 and 2014, those are on the bottom of the chart, compared to the cases of diabetes per 100 people in America. And we have different age groups. So the blue is the younger age group, 0 to 44. Then we've got middle age, that's in red, and early elderly in green, and then older elderly is over 75 in black. And what you're seeing is that as the years have gone on, you're seeing two things. As the years have gone on, the incidence of diabetes, the prevalence of diabetes in the population has gone from let's take a look at the 45 to 64-year-olds. The rate there was about 5%, and in 2014 it's doubled. It's now around 10%. And so what we're seeing, though, is it really hasn't changed that much when you're young. And what that means is that your exposure time, your own personal exposure to all these foods, increases your risk of having diabetes. So as the years have gone by, our diets have essentially gotten worse, and as the years have gone by and each person is exposed to this bad diet for longer and longer, we're at higher risk of developing diabetes. And it's a pretty high rate. Like if you look at between or over age 65, we have 20% of the population now with diabetes, which is extraordinary. And you name any chronic disease, and you're going to find that over the years, the rates have increased. So I've listed Parkinson's, where it's gone up since 1973. It's just about tripled. Bipolar disorder is astronomically gone up since 1985. Asthma has also somewhere around doubled, and food allergies have also gone up significantly, somewhere around doubling. So this diet is bad. And it's bad for, seems like it's bad for just about everything. There isn't a disease that improves from this diet. And so a lot of folks think that athletes are somehow different, that there's, I see this out there, and I hear this conversation that, well, there's a diet that's good for performance and a diet that's good for health, and the two are different. But I don't agree with that, and a lot of other really smart athletes also disagree with that idea. It just doesn't make sense that somehow athletes would be metabolically exempt from the rules that apply to everyone else. So, point 2, Americans changed our diets after we were told to avoid saturated fat. So that one piece of advice came to us somewhere around the late 1950s, early 1960, through a man named Ancel Keys, who is, it's a name that everybody should know because he's really the inventor of the junk food diet, in my opinion. He actually made a name for himself selling processed food to the military in World War II. If anybody's heard of K rations, which are the processed food packages that all the soldiers got, K stood for Keys. So he named it after himself, and it was just processed food. So he had these, theoretically, in my view, he probably had some connections to the processed food industry that were tainting his science, because he was a really dishonest scientist, and it doesn't make sense that somebody would be so dishonest unless there was some other reason. And I and many other people have detailed exactly what Ancel Keys did that was dishonest. And I have a link at the bottom there if anybody wants to read more. That links to my website, which is just like a short summary of it. But what you need to know is that before Keys, nobody was really worried about saturated fat. Keys used statistical misdirection to make it look like countries that ate more fat had more heart attacks, but he didn't include all the data, so that was a statistical trick he used that people didn't really get it. The media, of course, didn't get it. Some doctors did. And he lost some credibility to that. But he persisted, and he did more experiments. And another thing that he did was he used margarine in his experiments, which is made of trans fats. And in his experiments, he was showing that these solid fats, which he was calling saturated fat, which is not true. They were actually trans fats. He was showing that this margarine in his animal experiments were increasing the cholesterol levels in the rats and causing heart attacks and arteriosclerosis in these little rats. And although he was not lying in the publications, and if if a doctor was going to look up exactly what he did, they would see the truth. When he talked about it to the media, he always referred to solid fats like butter and eggs. And so he used two kinds of misdirection to fool the American public into believing that just eating butter and eggs was going to clog their arteries. And with that, that was really the beginning of the end of traditional cuisine. Now, if you tell people that you can't have butter and eggs, you're taking away breakfast for a lot of people. You're going to have a lot more people eating Eggos and cereal and, carby things. And you don't suddenly there's no reason to sell whole chickens. You're going to be getting boneless, skinless chicken breast instead of the whole animal, and you're taking away the skin and the access to bones, and you used to save all the bones. A lot of folks don't realize this, but people used to be pretty diligent about saving the bones of whatever animal they ate and making a soup out of it. And that is a whole different kind of nutrient for athletes. In our book, Deep Nutrition, we described 4 common elements of all traditional cuisines, and making bone stock, chicken stock, beef stock, whatever, is common to all of them, and it's actually a really great thing that the athletes that I work with, they totally love getting it back into their diets, and they notice that it helps their joints right away. So that's just an example of this one direction that we got from Ancel Keys, which was based on a bunch of lies. That has really changed our diet, and that I really think is why there's been such an explosion. It really helped the explosion of processed food, the acceptance of processed food by Americans. Now, the sad thing, it's not funny, is that at the time when Ancel Keys was supposedly looking for the cause of heart attacks, it probably was not dietary at all. What these 2 graphs show is that if you look at the top graph is United States cigarette consumption rates, and you see that this is per capita. You see that this curve correlates almost exactly with the curve underneath, the red curve underneath it, which is heart disease, age-adjusted deaths from heart disease. And again, per capita, so it's population adjusted. And they both peak somewhere around 1960, and they both start to drop off, and they're significantly, lower by 2000, both of them. And now that we have this retrospective data, it really suggests that at the time, and remember, this was before we had these obesity and diabetes epidemics, and of course diabetes is now the #1 cause of heart disease. But before that, it was probably cigarette smoking. Yet Keys was insisting it was saturated fat. And even though we have this evidence now, we're still talking about saturated fat as being a cause of heart attacks. And there's really never was any evidence to support it, and there still isn't any evidence to support it. And the disturbing thing is that this hasn't changed our guidelines. So there was a real big expose less than a year ago, so I think somewhere around April 2016, that came out in the British Medical Journal, where Dr. Chris Ramsden at the NIH, he followed up on the biggest nutrition study ever designed in this country, called the Minnesota Coronary Experiment, that was designed by Ancel Keys, and it was designed in 2 parts. The first part was going to show that, so Keys' idea was that saturated fat, was bad, and polyunsaturated fats from like vegetable oils were good. So he designed a study where he fed people 2 different diets. One was really high in polyunsaturated fats, and the other was supposedly high in saturated fat. And the first part of the study was designed to show that the polyunsaturated fats lowered cholesterol levels compared to the saturated fats. And that part was published because it was as predicted. The second part was never published, and it wasn't really fully completed either until this doctor at the NIH decided to take a look at the autopsy slides from the folks who were involved in this huge experiment. There was over 6,000 subjects and fed these 2 different diets. And what they had done at the time was they had taken autopsy samples at their death of their coronary arteries as well as their carotid arteries. So what they were looking for is, did one diet versus the other have an advantage over the other in causing or preventing the arteriosclerotic plaque as well as deaths. So it was a long study, right? It took years and years, but they never published the data until 2016. And what they published in 2016 was that Keys was wrong. The polyunsaturated fatty acid rich diet was actually worse than the other diet. Now, I mentioned it was supposedly a saturated fat diet, right? Actually, again, Keys used margarine. So what his research showed was that polyunsaturated fatty acids, which Keys said were healthy and which the government now still insists are healthy, were actually worse for us than margarine. And margarine is full of trans fat. And we have several cities have banned trans fat because it's so unhealthy. So this is really, really astounding. And Harvard is sticking with their guns. And the nutrition guidelines are not budging. We're still recommending polyunsaturated fatty acids now, in spite of the fact that we have evidence now that they are very unhealthy. So just to give you an idea of how much of these polyunsaturated fatty acids we are eating now compared to historically, I've put up a couple of charts that show the changes. All these squiggly lines are just, the different oils, different fat sources over the course of most of the 1900s. So starting in 1909 on the left, the chart on the left shows the vegetable oils, the liquids. So the chart C is soybean, cottonseed, corn, olive oil, and coconut oil. So soybean oil, you can see, was almost non-existent at the beginning or in 1909, and it was massively part of our diets by 1999, and it's increased since then. It's like probably another third on top of that. Canola oil on the just beneath that is the red line, just on the chart just beneath that. You can see that it actually it didn't exist. You can't really tell, but it wasn't introduced until 1985 because it's a kind of a new oil, and it's high in polyunsaturated fatty acids, and it's just taken off. It's exploded. Palm oil here is the dark blue line, and it's squiggling around a little bit there, but since 2000 it's exploded, and it now is at the level of canola consumption, which has also increased significantly since 1999. And then on the other side we see like the more traditional fats. So compared to like lard and green, we're not eating as much of that. Compared to butter, we're eating way less. It's gone from 8 pounds a year to 2 pounds. Beef tallow, interestingly, has increased a little bit. I don't honestly know where we're eating that, unless it's just hamburgers, because we are eating a lot of hamburgers. And then, shortening, which is made out of vegetable oils, and margarine have also increased in the main. The last two are decreasing now that we know that saturated fat is bad for us, but still it's historically unprecedented levels, more than 1,000-fold. Rise in our intake in these polyunsaturated fatty acid rich vegetable oils. So let's just define our terms a little bit. So when we're talking about a fat versus an oil, the fats are the solid. That's the only difference. The fats are solid at room temperature, and oils tend to be liquid. Now chemically, there's a reason for that, and it has to do, this is where we get into the definitions of saturated versus monounsaturated versus polyunsaturated. So the solid fats tend to have more saturated fatty acids, and the word saturated itself is simply referring to the carbon-carbon bonds. When all of the carbon-carbon bonds are single bonds or have as many hydrogens on them as possible, they're saturated with hydrogen, so it's a single bond. That's all it means. So, but what that does to the fatty acid chain is it straightens it out. So you can see that the saturated, all those blue balls are straight lines there. Now, when you unsaturate a bond, you take a couple carbons off of it, I'm sorry, a couple hydrogens off of it, and now you have a double bond between the carbons. And if you have one of those double bonds, it's called a monounsaturated fat. So like olive oil is high in monounsaturated fat. That monounsaturation gives the fatty acid a little kink. So it makes it more fluid, essentially. And if you have two of those double bonds that are unsaturated, it's called polyunsaturated, and that gives it two kinks, so it makes it a really wiggly thing. So the more of the polyunsaturated fatty acids you have in a product, the more liquid it is, the higher, the more it's going to stay liquid even if you put it in the fridge. So like if you put olive oil in the fridge, it tends to solidify, but if you put canola or soy oil in the fridge, it's still liquid. So that's just a definition. Now, the problem with the polyunsaturated fatty acids is that those two double bonds, they're closely spaced together. That's just how they are in the seeds, where these oils come from, whether it's corn or canola or soy or whatever. Those two double bonds are very close to each other. And that chemically means that that section there is an unstable molecule, and it breaks down very easily when it's processed, refined, or used for cooking, so when it's heated. So it's the processing that makes it extremely unhealthy in the end. Once the processing is all completed, there's broken down bits of the fatty acids, and there are new molecules that are created during the processing that were not there before. They were not there while they're in the seed. So that's why I have these little animals all over the place. Each one of these, it's just, these are all different animals. That's all I'm trying to get across. So fats are not all the same. There's the difference between solid fats and liquid fats. Those are called oils. The fatty acids are not all the same, and whether they're processed or not, they're all going to be different animals. The other thing that's important to know about this is that the saturated fats in butter and in avocado and coconut oil are much more stable, so that even if they are heated or even if they are refined, they're not going to break down. They're not going to become toxic. So I showed you the statistics on the polyunsaturated fatty acids. In my opinion, that is a very, very important and overlooked change in the past 50 years in our diet. We've heard a lot of conversation around the changes in carbohydrate, right? So what this graph shows is starting all the way back in 1909, we actually were consuming about as many carbohydrates as we are now, surprisingly. But what's different is the kind of carbohydrates. So where back in 1909 we were getting a lot of grains and very few sweeteners, now we've cut our grain consumption by about a third, and we've more than doubled our sweeteners. And when the obesity epidemic started, it was shortly after we introduced this high fructose corn syrup too. So we're eating, even though we're eating somewhat close to the same amount of carbohydrate, it's a very different kind of carbohydrate. It's more sweet, and that also makes it a different animal. So it's now's a good time to define, these. What are we talking about when we say simple carbs and complex carbs? People throw those words out. Simple carbohydrate simply means that it's a sugar. It's going to taste sweet, and so the technical term for this is a monosaccharide or a disaccharide. So glucose that is in our bloodstream, the main sugar in our bloodstream, is a monosaccharide. Table sugar is glucose, and I always forget it's glucose and fructose. And so it's two simple sugars stuck together. And when it's that small, it tastes sweet because it can fit into our taste buds. A complex carb just refers to a whole bunch of those simple sugars strung together to form a starch. And plants do this because it's a great way to store energy. The complex carb doesn't refer to whether or not it's been refined. So the refined carb, is stuff that we see as ingredients a lot, like flours, oatmeal, common breakfast. Those are complex carbs, but they're refined. So complex carb doesn't necessarily mean that it's a real healthy natural product. It can be processed. If we're talking about carbs that are healthy, you have to go to the whole grains. So things like oat grain or beans. So very different effects on our microbiome. And I think this is we're just starting to understand this and appreciate this more, is that when our diets can be equal in the amount of carbohydrate, but the type of carbohydrate has a drastic difference on which bacteria are growing in our guts and how fast that carbohydrate is going to get into the bloodstream. So that simple carbs have a tendency to promote the growth of pathogenic bacteria that don't do us any good. And they get into our bloodstream really fast, and they affect our insulin really fast. And on the other end of the spectrum, the whole grains, they have a lot of fiber in them, a lot of protein, they even contain fat. So they have a very, very different rate at which they get into our bloodstream and a very different effect on our insulin levels and a very different effect on our microbiome. And these things tend to have a beneficial effect, or at least not a harmful effect. So, point 3, today's diet is now composed of 80% of our calories coming from these refined carbohydrates and refined polyunsaturated fats from vegetable oil that were never part of our diet at all until the industrial era, because they're industrially refined. So here's just proof of the point I'm making about that there's a lot of that stuff. So this is from the USDA, and all the way on the right is the most recent data. The amount of vegetable fat, if you translate that into calories, what it's showing is that people on average are consuming 75 pounds per year. So that works out, if you just do the math, 850 calories a day per person, coming just from these polyunsaturated fatty acids that never existed before. And to me, it's always amazing that these things never existed before, and hardly anybody is talking about the fact that not only are we eating them, but doctors are telling us that they're healthy. How can they be so sure? These are industrial products. And so also statistics on the sugars. Again, I just did the math. So sugars and sweeteners, the total here is the blue line, and the total amount in pounds is somewhere around 130. So you do the math, and that's 637 calories per day per person. Quite a lot. And then there's the grains that we have to add in. And the same kind of math, that's around 814. You just add those things together, which I've done on the right, and grains plus sugar is 1450. The protein intake, which I got from the NHANES data, is 320 calories, and the polyunsaturates are 850. So I also broke it down on the bottom, so you can see that somewhere around 80% of our calories are coming from these highly processed, refined foods. So, no wonder we're sick. We're eating junk food. Okay, so now let's compare the standard American diet to what athletes are eating, or what we're telling athletes to eat. So we just looked at the macronutrients. I'll just go back here. Carb is somewhere around 50% on the bottom, proteins 17%, and fats around 33%. These are people who aren't necessarily trying to be healthy. Athletes, if they're following our, their nutritionist advice, they're presumably trying to be healthy. Well, a recreational athlete is having a very similar macronutrient breakdown. They're getting somewhere 250 is the average American carb intake, and athletes are told to have somewhere in that range if they're a recreational athlete. The protein amounts are just about the same, and so are the fats. And the only difference between a recreational athlete, or the main difference, is that the more high and level professional athlete or collegiate athlete is going to be burning more calories, and they're going to be getting significantly more carbohydrate. A higher proportion of their diet is going to be coming from carbohydrate. But still very similar to the standard American diet, which is mostly made out of junk food and makes everybody unhealthy eventually. Okay, so next point. Here's where we start focusing more on the athlete. So what happens when an athlete, what's the physiologic effect of all this carbohydrate on somebody who's trying to exercise? Well, actually, we're going to start out talking about just how this promotes obesity, right? So not necessarily in a heavily exercising individual. The average American exercises around 17 minutes a day, and the average exercise is walking. So that's about 75 calories, so not a lot of exercise. So let's say they wake up first thing in the morning after sleeping, after having a dinner and dessert. Their muscle glycogen is full. And when I learned this statistic that the total sugar in our bloodstream is only about 4 grams, and that's pretty shocking. So that means if you wake up and have like an average American breakfast, like a muffin and some vanilla soy milk, you're giving yourself a whopping 70 grams of carbohydrate, which gets converted to sugar. So that's the equivalent of 18 teaspoons of sugar, which is 18 times the amount that should be in your bloodstream. So your body freaks out and shoots out a ton of insulin. Insulin helps your body regulate that blood sugar, and it does so by pushing it somewhere else, getting it out of the bloodstream. And one of the things that insulin does is it makes the liver makes the liver like suck that sugar out of there and rapidly convert it into fat, and then it gets stored eventually as adipose. So insulin helps the liver to convert carbohydrate to fat. So it doesn't, you can see this happening over and over again during the day. A person's going to be making a lot of fat. So no wonder we're all gaining weight. But what I wanted to bring up here is the effect of insulin on your ability to burn fat. So insulin helps you store fat, and the way the cell works is at the same time, you're not going to be building fat out of glucose while you're also burning fat. So insulin actually inhibits the body's ability to release stored fat from fat tissue under the skin. And it doesn't take a lot of insulin to really powerfully inhibit. That's what this slide shows. So the units in black are European. The American units are in red there. And just 1.5 units of insulin, already you're blocking about half of your body's ability to break down fat. It's blocking a enzyme called hormone-sensitive lipase, which is how the fat under your skin gets the fat out of the storage area, so that it kicks it out into the bloodstream. So insulin directly inhibits that enzyme, and this is a pretty low level of insulin. If you have ever looked at a insulin blood test report, the normal value, the normal range actually starts at 5. So our normal ranges are skewed, and because a lot of people are eating so much carb, we're all walking around with so much insulin that our whole idea of what is normal needs to be reevaluated. But what I wanted to show is that just 11.5 units, you're pretty much 100% blocked your body's ability to release stored fat. So wow, it's terrible. So what happens during the day? This is from a study that evaluated the two different diets, well actually three different diets because they evaluated the baseline diet, which was the standard American diet. Um, and what you see here is a high carb diet, which was calorie restricted. This was for weight loss. And then a high fat diet, which interestingly was not calorie restricted, but this was looking at the effects of these three different diets on insulin. So at the baseline, you can see that the insulin levels really peak after each meal, higher than they do even on the high carb calorie restricted diet. And then on the high fat diet, again, no calorie restriction here, the effect on insulin is major. This is almost a flat line. Now, these are all overweight people. So as I mentioned there on the previous slide, it takes an insulin level pretty low for you to be able to get any significant fat burn going. These people are not easily burning fat because you can see how high their insulin level is. That like the lowest level on here is somewhere around 5. Now, there's other factors that help you promote fat burn, but like catecholamines, and we're going to get into that when we talk about exercise more. But just the insulin effect on the hormone-sensitive lipase here is basically turning off fat burn. And the point I wanted to make here is that at the baseline, the lowest you see in the morning, for most of the day actually, is 20. And actually, and let's see here, before dinner we kind of peak at around 12, and then it's not till after dinner that we get anywhere around 10. So that means for the average person, their fat burn is turned off by insulin for most of the day. Again, so no wonder they're gaining weight. Now, we're going to talk about the effects on exercise in a minute. But what happens here with dieters and why low-carb diets are gaining in popularity is because this effect of insulin makes people really hungry. And if you're having these insulin spikes throughout the day, what happens on the other end of it is that your glucose comes down pretty quick, but you're not able to burn fat because insulin blocks fat burn. So that when you ordinarily would just be clearing the blood sugar from your bloodstream and getting a normal blood sugar level, what's happening is now you're not able to burn fat at all, so you're starving for more sugar. And that's bad. And you do that over and over again, and you eventually become insulin resistant. And insulin resistance is a precursor to diabetes. So what I just showed you is basically how carbs, refined carbs in particular, eventually promote diabetes. Now, getting back to the idea of what's good for overall health is probably going to be good for performance, and what's bad for overall health is probably going to be bad for performance. What I'm thinking and what I'm seeing from working with athletes is that the insulin level being so high is essentially going to cause the athlete to be resistant to burning their own fat when triggered by catecholamines like adrenaline, and they'll become more dependent on glycogen, and when they're more dependent on glycogen, that wastes protein. So this is what I'm seeing and what I think is happening. This is not something you're going to read in textbooks. So I'm going to give you the reasoning that does come from textbooks. Everything else is basic physiology we're going to be talking about. So first, with some definitions. So when we talk about aerobic exercise versus anaerobic exercise, or cardio versus intense exercise, the whole definition of aerobic exercise is supposed to be that it's burning, you're using oxygen. And anaerobic exercise, you don't use oxygen. Anaerobic means without oxygen. It's a fermentation process. Aerobic exercise, or aerobic energy production using oxygen produces a lot more ATP per carbon molecule, whereas when you're just fermenting glucose and not using oxygen, it's about 2 to 5% of the energy that's produced per carbon molecule. So it's very inefficient. And for aerobic exercise, that can be fueled with fats, ketones, or glucose. But anaerobic is only with glucose because fat and ketones they require oxygen to use them for fuel. So my question to the exercise physiologists is why would, I mean, those exercise physiologists who insist that all athletes, no matter what kind of exercise they're doing, need to carb load, why would aerobic exercise require glucose? We're supposed to be able to burn fat and ketones. So the answer I get is that you need no matter what your exercise is, you need glycogen because the fat is only released slowly during exercise. So, and the glycogen is a lot faster. It's right there. It's right in the muscle, and it just gets into the muscle faster. So that's why. It's a matter of speed. And as the energy, as the intensity of your exercise goes up, then fat just can't get into the mitochondria fast enough to be burned, and you become more and more dependent on glucose. And so that if you don't have just a whole ton of glycogen in your muscle all the time, your performance is going to be impaired because you can't do anything intense because you won't be able to get that fat in the mitochondria fast enough. So that's their reasoning, and it kind of makes sense, but it only makes sense in the setting of a very high carb, particularly high refined carb diet that promotes insulin levels to be elevated most of the time. And so remember, we just saw that insulin levels are high if you're eating a lot of carbs. And here's what happens in the adipose cell, the fat cell. So there's this hormone called hormone-sensitive lipase, and insulin inhibits it. But catecholamines and a number of other hormones here will turn it on. And so once it's turned on, then that fat cell starts breaking down all its triglyceride and releasing the fat into the bloodstream so that it can be picked up by the muscle and the liver and everywhere else, every other tissue. So it releases free fatty acids and glycerol. Glycerol is just the backbone that the three fatty acids were bonded to. So this is the key toggle point here, because if you have too much insulin, then it's going to inhibit the effect of the catecholamines, the adrenaline, and the ACTH is what stimulates cortisol release, and the glucagon. So an athlete is going to need more adrenaline to be able to access their stored body fat. They'll still be able to get the sugar, but to access that stored body fat, it's just there's a delay because insulin is slowing it down. This isn't like an absolute. It's not really like a red light, green light here. It's like a balance. So the more insulin there is, the more that it's toggling down the effect of the catecholamines. So let's just spell this out here. So the more insulin that an athlete, so the top here is looking at what's going on in a muscle cell. And in the muscle we have a little bit of stored triglyceride fat and a good amount, it takes up more space because it's less calorie dense, glycogen. And the exercising muscle has to have one of those to create, one of those has to be broken down to create ATP. And when on the top, what we're seeing is that if there's insulin around, that triglyceride doesn't get into the muscle, and any triglyceride that's stored in the muscle also doesn't get broken down. So you just don't get fat being converted to ATP, and you have a lot more glycogen being converted to ATP energy by the mitochondria. And as time goes by, then we see down on the bottom that muscle cell is going to be depleted of its glycogen. Okay, so that's what happens in the muscle on a high-carb diet. Here's what happens in the liver. Very similar. So you're not. So on the top, we're seeing that a high-carb diet with a lot of insulin around, you're going to have impaired delivery of the fat to the liver, so that the liver is not going to be able to. What the liver does is it makes ketones. And so there's a lot of talk now about a ketogenic diet. Your liver's always making ketones. It's just going to make a lot more if you're on this diet that has just tons of fat in it, and it's going to pump out lots more ketones. But the liver, whenever it gets fat, it always tries to make ketones out of it. But when you're on a high-carb diet, you're not getting the fat delivered. So you really have to, for the liver to help out and get the athlete the energy it needs for the muscle, is going to have to be breaking down the glycogen into glucose and releasing just a ton of glucose. And over time, what's going to happen is that not just within that particular exercise bout, but day, after week, after month, the whole process of converting glycogen, or the liver being able to have enough glycogen all the time, has to upregulate the process of converting protein into glucose, which is called gluconeogenesis. And that means that a high carb athlete is going to have a lot more need for amino acids. And this is really supported by a lot of literature that we don't have time to go over in this, but if you look at the literature around protein fueling, it's all done in high carb, in a setting of a high carb athlete, which there's a lot of reason to believe that athlete is wasting protein. And there's a lot of reason to believe that your protein needs are much less when you are not basically, essentially, in a slightly insulin resistant state here, in a fat burn resistant state. So here's what happens on a low carb diet. This is a more, seems to me, a more natural or ideal situation for aerobic exercise, that you have a normal amount of fat delivered to the muscle. The muscle hormone-sensitive lipase then can break down the fat and produce a lot of ATP. Over time, what's going to happen is that triglyceride fat is going to reduce a little bit, and you would think. So here's where things get a little interesting. You would think that the glycogen would not go down because it's not being used for ATP. But what we see is that it actually is depleted. It's just that it refills itself. So this comes from a really important and interesting study that was done by some of the leaders in the whole low-carb athlete movement, Finney and Bullock. So they did a study a year or two ago where they took 20 very high-level athletes and divided into two groups. 10 of them were having a high-carb diet and 10 of them were having a low-carb diet for a very long time. So an average of 20 months they had to adapt to this particular diet. And so these are high-level athletes doing a lot of exercise every day. Then they tested to see what was the effect of exercise on their muscle glycogen. So we just saw that, like, what you would think from the top here is that the muscle glycogen wouldn't be used if they're not burning fat. I'm sorry, if they're not burning carb. But what they found was that here's the exercise protocol on the lower left. They have a little bit of a pre-exercise meal, and this was mostly done so that the high-carb athletes wouldn't bonk. The high-carb ones got a high-carb shake, the low-carb athletes got a low-carb, very high-fat shake, and then they ran for a long time, 3 hours at, pretty much optimal fat burn, 65% VO2 max, and then they tested their muscle glycogen. They got another shake, and then they tested their muscle glycogen again 2 hours after that. So on the right, what we see is the glycogen levels in the muscle, and at baseline they were about the same, even though one was a low-carb diet. After all that intense exercise, they were about the same. This isn't statistically significantly different, although the low-carb diet was a little bit lower. And then after the shake, even though the athletes that were on the low-carb diet and got their low-carb shake, there was very little carb in there, they repleted their glycogen stores just as well as the other guys. And so there's really no evidence of glycogen depletion relative to high carb, though. That's the thing. That's the main thing, right? So we're all this discussion about athletes need to have carbohydrate all the time. Well, if their insulin levels are low, they burn fat much more efficiently, and they really don't need carb for aerobic exercise anywhere near as much. And that's what this slide shows. So this is a test called Metabolic cart, where you can actually analyze the fuel that an athlete is consuming during exercise. And so what they do, the top one shows the carbohydrate oxidation, how that compared I'm sorry, the top one shows the fat oxidation in the two groups, and the bottom graph shows the carbohydrate oxidation in the two groups. So as you would expect, the low carb group was burning a lot more fat than the high carb group, and vice versa. The high carb group was burning a lot more carb than the low carb group. No surprises here. But two more points I want to make about this study. The first one is that you can see even in the high carb group that the fat burn increases with time. So that's exactly what Dr. Coyle from the Gatorade Sports Science Institute predicts, right? That the primary reason that glycogen reserves are essential is that athletes can only slowly convert their body stores into energy during exercise. But that only applies if you are this catecholamine resistant, high insulin, high carb athlete. If you are a better fat burner, your insulin levels are lower, and you don't have any problem starting right off the bat burning fat. So this is, if you look down to where it's the exercise is 0 minutes here at the bottom of this graph, you can see that right off the bat, those fat burning, the low carb athletes are burning about as much fat as they are in the end. So there's no inhibition there from insulin because their insulin levels are low. But the high carb athletes have major inhibition, and that's disinhibited partly during that 3-hour massive exercise bout. But you can imagine that if they were just eating less carb and had less insulin, they'd be just like the other group. And so this idea that glycogen reserves are essential is based on a false idea that fat is a slower fuel. That's only true if you are an athlete with abnormally high levels of insulin. If you're an athlete where your insulin levels are down to a more optimal range, fat is pretty fast. Again, we're still talking about aerobic exercise, not anaerobic, obviously. So the other interesting thing that was discovered with this very important study is that, take a look at what we're seeing here. This is how much carbohydrate, on the left we see how much carbohydrate was burned by the low carb group. The high fat group was burning very little carbohydrate, yet their glycogen level went down as much as it did from the other group. And what they calculated out was that so you might think, okay, well, so that's just because they used their muscle glycogen and they didn't need to use liver glycogen, and the high carb also used liver glycogen. But it wasn't just that. There was actually more glycogen that was broken down by the low carb guys. They broke down more glycogen than they burned. In other words, their muscle cells or their liver, it's not clear which one. Actually, I'm sorry, it's the muscle. The muscle cells were breaking down glucose. They were breaking down glycogen, and then they were breaking glucose down, presumably. But they never oxidized that glucose. Why was it there? Why did they break it down? And so we don't really know, but the authors were hypothesizing that the glycolysis cycle in the muscle, we've always been assuming that it's there so that athletes can have access to sugar, but that may be a wrong assumption. It may be there primarily for other intermediates. So what I mean by other intermediates, this is all the enzymes that the human body has and how they're interconnected. In the lower middle here is the TCA cycle, or the glycolytic cycle. As you can see, this thing is connected to a lot of other cycles. So it's not just there to produce energy. It's there producing all kinds of intermediates for all kinds of other things that the cell might use, which we haven't figured out yet, but the Bullock and Finney were hypothesizing that it's producing NADH and NADP and just helping support the mitochondrial function. So bottom line is there's a lot more going on in a cell than the glycogen-centered exercise model takes into account. And I'm just looking at the clock here, so I'm sorry, I'm sort of maybe I'm going to run a little bit over an hour. I apologize for that. But I want to go over this. This part is a lot quicker. So what happens with the polyunsaturated fatty acids when we're eating so many? Well, it looks like they can impair mitochondrial function and that reduce the ATP, the ability of the mitochondria to produce ATP. So just a few, just to remind you, mitochondria, you need a lot of them in your skeletal muscle. Here's inside of mitochondria. What's going on here is that the way the mitochondria produces energy is that the citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle, breaks down the acetyl-CoA that's delivered to the inside of the mitochondria, and as it does, it pumps out a bunch of protons into the intermembrane space. And when those protons flow back in now along the gradient, it's like they're creating a dam structure, and they come through the turbine essentially, which makes ATP. So you have to have that pressure of hydrogens in the intermembrane space. And if you don't have hydrogens in the intermembrane space, there's nothing coming through that little turbine where it says the proton flow back in generates ATP. You're not generating ATP. So that's how the mitochondria produces ATP. Now, different fatty acids have different effects on the mitochondria, and a very interesting piece of research was done quite a while ago that you haven't probably heard anything about. In 2002, they tested different fatty acids and how do they affect the mitochondria. And it turns out that different fatty acids, particularly the fatty acids in the polyunsaturated vegetable oils, they depolarize the mitochondrial membrane potential. In other words, they poke little holes in here, and what happens is you get an uncoupled mitochondria where there's holes in this thing that's supposed to be a dam, and instead of only flowing through the proton pump, protons can leak back in through the inner mitochondrial membrane itself and not produce any energy. So the more depolarized, the more dysfunctional the mitochondria, and the mitochondria actually don't last that long once they're depolarized. So what we're looking at here is they tested 4 different kinds of fatty acids. So stearic and oleic are about the same. Stearic acid is a fully saturated fatty acid. Oleic is monounsaturated, is the one in olive oil. And then we have linoleic, which is an omega-6, and linolenic, which is an omega-3. And you can see that the more omega-3 fatty acids are actually more polyunsaturated, they have more double bonds. So they actually are worse for mitochondria, omega-3 fats, the reason that we take fish oil. They're actually worse for mitochondria. So this is calling a lot of things that we've come to accept as truths into question. And the reason, so I just want to explain a little bit of why these polyunsaturated fatty acids might be bad, right? They're essential fats. They're supposed to be good for us. Well, the reason they're bad, as I mentioned earlier, is they're unstable and they break down easily. They break down when they're exposed to heat. They break down when they're exposed to oxygen. And in the cell, they really break down when they're exposed to iron and peroxide that occur during exercise. Or the peroxide occurs during exercise. And iron, of course, is in our bloodstream and in a lot of our cells. And they cause, this breakdown process causes oxidative stress and leads to the production of a lot of toxic compounds. These compounds are actually quite toxic. Each one of them has been shown to damage DNA and cause cancer, and in and of themselves can uncouple mitochondria. So the more polyunsaturated fatty acids you have in your diet, whether it's omega-3 or omega-6, the more oxidative stress you're going to have in your muscle mitochondria, and the harder it's going to be for those poor little mitochondria to work properly. And so this is just showing that we're coming to understand that depolarizing mitochondria it's not only bad for exercise because you can't produce ATP, it's something that is found in like a lot of diseases, like all of them. Like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, bipolar, all the ones that I showed the statistics of earlier, diabetes, we're finding that there's unhealthy, defective mitochondria, and it's, I think, a lot to do with the fact that we're consuming all this polyunsaturated fatty acid, and it's just horrible for our poor little mitochondria that can't function. This is a very interesting study on the effect of polyunsaturated fat-rich corn oil versus olive oil and normal rat chow on activity in mice. And they found something you kind of would expect if an animal's mitochondria were not healthy, that the animal wouldn't want to move. They wouldn't feel like exercising. And this was a very strong correlation here. You can see that the normal chow, which has very little polyunsaturated fatty acid, the olive oil, which has a little bit more coming from the olive oil, and then the corn oil, which has a ton more polyunsaturated fatty acid. There's a vast difference here in the spontaneous exercise. So as it goes down, that's less activity. And then what we're seeing on the right is just how they actually had like laser beams in the little mouse cages, and they were able to track the different activities of the mice. And so versus a mice like running around all night long and scurrying about and doing mouse things, it was just like a super lazy mouse. And these mice also gained more body fat. So this is what we're doing to our athletes by encouraging them to consume too much polyunsaturated fatty acid, and it's certainly what we're doing to everyone else who's even not an athlete. We're just making them not want to exercise. That's not cool. So the last thing I wanted to mention was, it seems kind of like silly not to consider the fact that we store most of our energy in body fat. We don't store a lot of energy in glycogen. And we're talking about like at least 100,000 calories of energy in body fat versus maybe 1,000 in glycogen. It seems logical that nature would be doing this because it is the best fuel for aerobic activity. And it's not just us, it's every other kind of animal. Whether you're talking about like an aerobic, a primarily aerobic migrating bird, this is an Arctic tern that like they're like the longest migrators. Their migration is something around 20,000 each year to go like pretty much from the North Pole most of the way to the South Pole. And then even cheetahs that are, you would think of as high intensity, they store most of their energy as fat as well. So why would people be any different? And I think it's, time, no matter, if you've not heard of these thoughts before, I mean, if you're not really part of like the whole low carb movement, if you don't really get behind that, I would just ask you to consider that, to suggest that the human athlete needs to primarily burn glycogen and sugar and not fat, when the rest of the animal world is primarily burning fat, is suggesting something pretty extraordinary, that either humans are unique, which I don't believe because most of our DNA is pretty identical to all these other animals, just nature recycles a lot of our genes, or that we're essentially, by having athletes eat sugar, we're essentially biohacking, right? We're outdoing nature. And while that is theoretically possible, I think that it's not super likely because of the fact that the same diet that's bad for everyone else is causing diabetes, is causing all these other diseases. I think it just is important to try to put things in perspective using as many different kinds of fields of science as possible to support a conclusion. And I've already seen as a physician a really big sea change already in the weight loss meetings. When I went to, back in 2006 and 2008, you go to a weight loss meeting, it's all about calorie restriction. Now, most of it is about low carb diets and how to get people to adopt a low carb diet. And so I think the sports medicine world is just lagging behind a little bit, and part of it I didn't really talk about, but the fact that here's just some references for people to look at if they're interested. There's a lot of industry conflict of interest, and I think that's part of why we've all been eating so unhealthy for the past 50 years, but more so than anywhere else, there's conflict of interest in the sports nutrition world. And there's been several very damning exposés on published that I've linked to here about how there was information, there's researchers who know that what they're doing is really not good research, but they're doing it and publishing it anyway. I think that we don't all have to wait for Harvard or the government to tell us what we should be eating. And patients are voting with their feet. So, and athletes are starting to do the same. There are more and more professional athletes that are rethinking this. They're getting more natural fats in their diet, and they're not doing quite so much carb loading. So with that, I'll open up to questions if there's anybody hanging in there. Do I have to click something?
Dr. Shanahan, yes. Over in the question column, there are around 7 or 8 questions. We could take a few minutes to answer a few of them.
Okay. Gosh, I'm not seeing any questions. Oh, wait. Show answered questions? No, I don't see any.
Okay.
Do you want to read?
Yeah. Well, this one just came from Beth Scott. What does it make a difference between natural and organic PUFA oils?
No, very good question. So organic versus natural just refers to whether or not when it was on the field it got pesticides, but it doesn't have any bearing on the refining process, which is really where a lot of the damage occurs to the polyunsaturated fatty acids.
Okay. Another question. The way I understand the research, poly, mono, and unsaturated fats are not helpful. The diet should be 10 to 12% calories from fat. More than any source, impair mitochondrial function and endothelial function, and increases in cancer for risk for cancer, heart disease, and many other chronic conditions.
Yeah, so that is a great point, because here's where this slide helps to address that. So it depends what kind of fat you're studying, and the most of the animal studies that I've seen on that have shown this increases in fats and how they affect mitochondrial health, they're using polyunsaturated fats. So of course, compared to no fat, if you're using polyunsaturated fat, and this is dramatic problems in the mitochondria in just a few minutes from being exposed to a lot of linoleic acid, which is polyunsaturated fat. I think that really is something that has not been paid enough attention to, and has confused a lot of scientists into telling people that their studies are concluding things that they're not in any way concluding. They're just showing that polyunsaturated fatty acids are unhealthy. So ready for the next question.
All right, would you like one more question?
Sure.
All right. If 80% of our diet is refined carbs and vegetable oils, where does animal food fit in? She went on to say the World Health Organization, the 2014 data says Americans eat 25% of their calories from animal foods. So
yeah, so let's take a look at those statistics I had. It's that 25% is kind of close to 20%. So I think it kind of depends on how you do the statistics, but they're not incompatible statistics. They're pretty close. And it's always really hard to judge exactly what a population is eating, because we're really relying on what people are remembering, as well as there's something, the most accurate data, comes from disappearance data, so this is what's going away, like what is being sold, and what is being produced, and what is being sold. But it has to assume a certain amount of wastage. So there's always a little bit of error in every calculation. And I would say that those two things are pretty close. They're coming to kind of the same conclusion.
Okay. I'd like to thank Dr. Shanahan for this wonderful presentation. Again, a link to the presentation will be offered to everyone who registered for the webinar. Again, thank you for supporting CEPA. We hope to see you again. Take care.